Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Employment Law Counselor Podcast presented by White & Williams, LLP. I'm your host, Jeff Stewart, and each and every episode, we tackle the laws and regulations that make up the world of labor and employment law. Today, we'll be covering misclassification of employees as independent contractors. While our podcast is not legal advice, it is a practical discussion between two attorneys that deal with the maze and minefield of labor and employment laws on a daily basis. As always, I'm joined by one of my colleagues here at White & Williams to discuss our topic of the day. Today, I'll be joined by Jim Anelli, who heads up our labor and employment group and practices out of our Newark office.
Hello, Jeff.
Glad I didn't scare you away from the podcasting world after our last episode, so I'm glad to have you back.
I'm doing great, Jeff. Looking forward to the program.
Well, why don't we dive right in? Jim, why don't you give our listeners an overview of, the differences between an independent contractor and an employee?
Well, Jeff, I think I could make a living just talking about those two questions these days. To give you some sense, every year there are billions of dollars in legal proceedings that largely are based around those two questions. What is an employee and what is an independent contractor? To make things even more interesting, the question may often be decided. It depends on what particular statute or law that we're talking about, because not every statute or every law has the same standard. Back in the 80s, I'm dating myself, we had a test of whether we wanted VHS or Betamax. We only had two options. Well, in the wonderful world of employment law, we've got two options too, employee and independent contractors. The issue, though, is there's many, many different laws, and how they're defined depends on what law and what state and what locality that we have to be in. But as a general rule, because we have to say something here, an employee is an individual who works in an office space or a warehouse, or maybe they drive a truck, or they perform some type of service. And essentially, they don't have their own tools. They don't have their own company. They don't really have any economic risk. They're not, out there writing their own contracts. They're not providing their own tools in order to do their job. They're what you think most of the time when you walk into, say, a restaurant and you see a waiter or waitress, waiting on a table. That's what you think of. I think most people would think an employee is. An independent contractor, conversely, is someone who has potentially their own company. They may not provide requests for, or wages. Basically they provide a bill for their services. They have their own sets of tools. They have their own business. They have many, many clients that they work at or deal with. And typically they have a profession or a trade that is different than the profession, trade, or service that a company is providing to the general public. And so these are some of the questions that investigators look at in determining whether someone has been properly classified as an independent contractor or an employee.
And I think it's important to note that for employers, there's actually an economic incentive for them to try to classify people as independent contractors. Because if you have someone classified as an independent contractor, you don't have to provide benefits to them. You don't have to pay employer-side Social Security taxes, which, that's 6.2% of payroll for Social Security, another 1.45% for Medicare. So that's more than 7.5% on top of the wages that you're paying that you then don't have to pay. And there's also this perception that, we can let that person go anytime. There is not that ongoing relationship that you think of in the employee-employer context.
And you don't have to worry about classification as exempt or non-exempt, or whether the wages have been set correctly. And there's a whole host of reasons why employers would have a significant interest in hiring individuals as independent contractors. And hence, that has occurred. There has been a dramatic increase in the number of independent contractors throughout the entire country over the last 15 to 20 years. It was relatively common 20 to 25 years ago, there were very few independent contractors. And over the last 10 to 15 years, that has not only accelerated, even during the COVID period, it's rapidly increased in many different industries. And there are different reasons for it. One is a lot of individuals who are independent contractors want the freedom to set their own hours. They want the ability to more or less control their destiny in many ways. And I think there's a freedom aspect about it that is very appealing to those individuals. Employers certainly have an economic interest in wanting to classify individuals as independent contractors. And they may even have a legal basis of avoiding liability in many areas, avoiding potential types of employment claims in the workplace. There are a lot of different reasons why an employer might see a benefit to having that type of arrangement.
And from the employee perspective, the biggest thing that they see is more money in their pocket. When I get a paycheck, the first thing it says is, this is federal tax withheld, FICA tax withheld, local tax withheld, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have all these withholdings, and then you have your net pay, which is significantly less than the gross pay. Well, if you're an independent contractor, you get the gross pay, and it's up to you to deal with any tax issues, et cetera. So from an employee standpoint, they're getting the full check. And a lot of people, that's what they want. Hey, the more money in their pocket, the quicker. That's what they want. So this is the rare instance where the employer has an economic incentive, but the employee sees an economic incentive as well.
Very much so. The individuals who classify themselves as independent contractors, I was looking at various surveys, particularly in California, and there was a very high interest in these individuals remaining independent contractors. There was not an interest in becoming, an employee. And I think part of that is also tax driven in that they have their own specific entities that they may form, an LLC, a PC, and they get the benefit of a lot of the tax advantages that individual employees may not get. They may get write-offs, a lot of write-offs in connection with the operation of their business that individual employees may get. And so we have a tax code that definitely, there's no question in the world, incentivizes people to be an independent contractor, from that standpoint. And so it's a much broader issue than many times people realize in that regard. And it's a huge issue on the other side. You mentioned Social Security contributions. Well, Social Security is about to go broke in about 15 to 20 years unless there's major infusions of cash. And I can tell you right now that Congress and also at the state level, when it comes to catching up on employment taxes, this is a multi-billion, we're talking, tens of billions of dollars per year here in taxes. This is a huge area of interest to federal and state governments, and it's going to get more interesting as the number of independent contractors increases. And there was a time there when independent contractor in certain areas was actually growing faster than employment. And so it's not a small issue. This is a gargantuan issue in our economy, in the workplace, and how individuals work inside of a particular profession or industry.
And it used to be, Jim, that in order to test whether somebody was an independent contractor or an employee, the IRS issued a test that was looked at 20 different factors. And it was everything from, do they have their own tools, to who provides insurance, who sets the hours, things like that. And several years ago, they changed that test to a much more simplified, I'll say, but I won't call it clearer, test on control. Do you want to talk about the control test?
Yeah, so this is an area that has, over the years, really cried out for simplification. The 20-factor test has been around, oh my gosh, probably 80 years. And it has 20 factors, hence the name. And they're not necessarily all weighted evenly, but the clear winner in that group was the control test. And what effectively it means is that nobody has the right to control how you perform your particular job or service to a third party as a worker. You control how you do a particular job or how you provide a particular service, and you're free from control of any third party in that regard. And so the IRS looked at that as being the main requirement and a way to simplify the analysis. These are, as you can see, are highly factual tests as to whether or not someone, meets the requirements. And, the burden is on the independent contractor to show that they are an independent contractor. And the burden is on the employer as well to, from the standpoint of employment taxes, for example, or unemployment contribution taxes, to show that the individual is a independent contractor. I should also mention there are other tests as well. Economic realities test, which is sort of a different focus. It came out about 15 years ago. And then there's even something called the ABC test, which you find more in the unemployment area, where employers make unemployment contributions into a centralized fund, and that fund then is used by the states with respect to unemployment claims, statewide. And that is a very different test than the economic reality test. So that's what I was getting at before. There's basically three tests. There's the control test, the economic realities test. By the way, the economic realities test simply, it's what it sounds like, is that you actually have skin in the game, that you actually, if an employer or if a company were to cancel its contract with you, you would not then become unemployed, that you actually have an independent, economic, thriving business apart from the particular company that may be deemed to be the employer. And in those circumstances, they look at that analysis. And the ABC test is quite different altogether. There are three main tests, and you have to meet each test. The first has to do with performing services at a particular company, whether it's the same type of services the company is already performing there at a location or whether they're different. Again, whether the individual is independent of the company that is providing services to. And, then sort of the economic reality component is, would they be a successful standalone organization or business if the contract with the company fell through, or would they be forced to file an unemployment claim? And failure of any of those three tests means that you fail the test altogether. So what we've noticed over the past 5 to 10 years, states are moving more towards the ABC test. The control test is important with respect to the IRS, but where all the action is at the Department of Labor level, both at the federal and the state, and also in state unemployment contribution claims, which are really thriving. It's important to understand what's going on out there. So the Department of Labor is now in the 21st century. So they have access to all the federal tax returns, typically in most states, and they can get Schedule Cs, they can get all sorts of tax information, and they can run computer-generated printouts or reports that will actually give them a review of all 1099 payments by a particular organization. It's very common for mid-sized businesses to receive assessments in the $100,000 to $500,000 range. That is not unusual at all. We've had assessments as high as $1 million in a simple unemployment contribution claim. So these are pretty substantial claims, and it's an interesting area that's growing more interesting by the day.
And what you said there a moment ago, I want to piggyback on, which is a lot of times these claims arise not because someone brought a complaint that said, hey, I was misclassified, but somebody stops working at a place and files for unemployment. And the unemployment office says, we have no record of you working at such and such a place. They say, no, I worked there for the last 3 years. And then they look into it. And that's what kind of starts the ball rolling. And if they're looking at one person, I guarantee you they're looking at anyone at that company that is classified as an independent contractor. So that's an area that we see things. The other is if people get hurt and they file a workers' compensation claim, and the same thing happens where, they say, well, wait, you're not here. We don't have you essentially in the system as working for this employer. That's going to be a problem. And the employer says, no, they were an independent contractor. We don't know anything on this. And that's where the issue first comes to light.
Right. And right now, to give you some sense, for about the past 3 years, these types of audits typically arise exactly in unemployment type situation, or alternatively, they are aware of an industry where there's a very high prevalence of use of independent contractors, and they get to know a particular industry very well and understand almost immediately who they might want to look at in terms of the independent contractors. They'll actually, in many instances, collect data, but they have a list of 1099 payments, and they can actually give me a printout almost immediately as we get notice of a particular investigation. So this really isn't a situation anymore where you got some bureaucrat, trying to wade through a mound of information. They have a lot of this information at their fingertips, and they just press a button. It prints out a report. So that's why the days of the audits that may have been around 5 or 10 years ago are sort of history at this point, and we're into the electronic data age.
And the other thing is the agencies are talking to each other now. I remember dealing with an audit 10 years ago, probably now, where it arose in the unemployment compensation arena. And they essentially, all they wanted was past unemployment taxes. They did not care about anybody else. They didn't pass the information on to anyone else. So we didn't have to worry about it. That is not the case today. Now, the agencies, the federal agencies, the state agencies, they are talking to each other. So that if this arises in one area, I guarantee you'll be dealing with it across all areas. Now, Jim, I guess one thing I want to ask is, do you advise your clients to utilize independent contractor agreements to kind of set forth this is the terms of the relationship?
That's an interesting question. Certainly 5 or 10 years ago, there was almost a recognition that if a company was incorporated, had its own insurance, provided its own tools, had its own separate office space, that would clearly be something that the state or federal Department of Labor would find to be an independent contractor relationship. And the fact that there was an agreement would almost assure that that type of arrangement would be successful. Over the past 3 or 4 years, in my opinion, there's been a movement away from simply accepting an independent contractor agreement as evidence in and of itself that there is such a relationship. And I think what's happening is that the Department of Labor is seeing so many of these agreements, and they are all typically the same. They all are typically a template in an organization. And so let's say you have an organization with 40 or 50 independent contractors, and every agreement looks exactly the same, and it's a template document. They'll look at that and basically say, well, it's nice that you have an agreement, but we're going to look beyond that. And that's been my experience for the last 3 or 4 years. So I would say this: I'd like to have independent contractor agreements in order to assure that the relationship between the independent contractor and the company is spelled out sufficiently, because I think it depends on the type of the work and what's involved. But there are times when it's kind of critical to have an agreement. An example would be where you have a independent contractor that is given particularly sensitive information in providing ongoing consulting services, and you have a non-compete agreement. And by the way, it's funny, there's a certain belief that having an independent contract, a non-compete agreement means that automatically it's not an example of an independent contractor relationship. That's not true. And the Department of Labor doesn't look at it that way. They understand the need to protect information and clients, and they don't look at that per se as an indication that there's not an independent contractor relationship. So there are times, definitely, when you want to have that type of an agreement. But if the reason you're doing it is the belief that if you have a template form of document, it's going to ward off any type of investigation or imposition of any type of tax, then that's no longer the case.
I tend to agree. I like them simply to set forth that everyone agreed at the beginning of the relationship that this was not an employment relationship and that it was an independent contractor, so that if an independent contractor says, well, wait, I thought I was an employee, you have something there. But I agree with you, it is not the end all be all that it may have seemed like it was 10 years ago.
And it can be particularly important in the benefit area where someone has an agreement, indicates that they don't want benefits. They understand they're not entitled to benefits. And then, of course, something happens and they file a huge benefit claim saying they should have been given, healthcare insurance, or they should have been given pension benefits or something of that nature. It does come up, from time to time.
Okay. Well, thank you, Jim. I want to wrap up our discussion here as I always do with a few takeaways. Do you have one takeaway for our audience?
I do. I think if you're going to hire independent contractors, I would evaluate them on a case-by-case basis. If you're going to have agreements, I would try to have those agreements tailored to the situation. If you're using independent contractor agreements en masse, and they all sort of look the same and they cover a lot of different workers in your organization, I can almost guarantee you that they're not independent contractors. But there is definitely a need in many companies for ongoing consulting services, professional services in various areas. And in those types of situations, it's perfectly fine to have an independent contractor agreement to cover those situations. So I would say just be careful and be thoughtful in terms of how you decide to bring on independent contractors.
And I guess the takeaway I would give is that there may be short-term economic gain by misclassifying someone as an independent contractor rather than an employee. And that's, for both, for the individual and for the employer. But the employer faces some severe financial penalties if they're audited and they were wrong, and if they have been classifying somebody as an independent contractor improperly. So if you have questions about that, absolutely speak to your attorney, because this is one you don't want to get wrong.
No, and if you think about it, Jeff, you have a situation where if you do misclassify somebody as an independent contractor and you're using a lot of the same agreements, you now have a situation where you got to go back into all these agreements and redo all of them. And that becomes its own problem down the road. So couldn't agree more with your thoughts in terms of how to handle this.
Absolutely. So, Jim, I want to thank you. And to our listeners, I want to say thanks for joining us here on the Employment Law Counselor podcast, where we try to make sense of the world of labor and employment law. On behalf of myself and on behalf of Jim Anelli, we thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave us a 5-star review, tell your friends, and subscribe to the podcast. For more information on this and many other topics, please visit our blog at www.theemploymentcounselor.com. Until next time, stay safe and stay compliant.